This is Ira Gorlick, and in this lecture I'm going to try to define net neutrality. So what is net neutrality? Net neutrality is a marketing name created to represent an idea that network providers should be neutral and not take sides in favoring one set of bits that flow through their network over another. In essence, the people who support net neutrality want the network providers to look a lot like Switzerland. They want them to be neutral. They don't want them to take sides from one to another. Now let me give you a sort of visual view of what I'm talking about. There exists these things called end users. You and I. You're watching this, you're an end user, I'm an end user. And there also exist things called content providers. You're watching this on Udemy. Udemy would be a content provider. And they make money by selling stuff to end users. In between the content providers and the end users is a thing called the network providers. Now, the way net neutrality should work is that when an end user works with a content provider, the network provider should be neutral. They shouldn't be involved in that relationship. All they should be doing is transporting the bits from the content provider to the end user. So what net neutrality is then is that the end user should decide what content provider they go to, not the network provider. The network provider should not get between the end user and the content provider. The network provider must treat all like content the same. The network provider must be neutral in regards to the data between the end users and the content providers. All right, essentially that's what it is, but it's not that easy. So let me go into a little more detail. So why is this an issue today? Well, when the internet was born, it was born in more or less in a net neutrality environment. But things have changed since the internet was born. The internet started out as a research network operated by public entities. It's now a commercial network operated for profit by for-profit providers. The internet started out as a network connecting small community of users, and it's now a vast global network. The internet started out as an academic community that trusts everyone, and it's now an open community where some people we know intend to do harm to others. And this is the most important one here in terms of how it's changed. When the internet was born, it was born from a network that only transported similar types of asynchronous bits to today to a network that transports a lot of different types of bits, both asynchronous and synchronous. And I'm going to explain asynchronous and synchronous in a second. Now these changes, these four changes that I identified, put huge pressures on the internet's original technical foundations of network neutrality. So let me talk a little about packet switching. The internet changed the telecommunications world because it used packets to move bits of information. Before the internet, we had circuit switched networks. Now we use packets. So as I show here in this graphic, a packet comes from one, it goes in the network, can take any number of different paths, and ends up at the end user. You're transmitting packets, and I'm going to provide a few more examples as we move forward. The best way to think of a packet network is to think of a road, and it's a common, fairly accurate analogy of a packet network is a road network where cars are the packets. So if you look at a road and you look at all the cars, each one of those cars would be equivalent to a packet on the packet network. They all have their own address and origination address and destination address, and it doesn't really matter what's in the cars. All the cars are pretty much equal. They all have to obey the same speed limits and the same laws. And so while it's a common and fairly accurate analogy to think of a packet network as roads, it's also a common and fairly accurate analogy to net neutrality in that the road provider should treat all cars the same, independent of who's in the car or where they're going. In other words, you don't want the road provider to say that certain cars can go and certain cars can't, that liberal cars can go and conservative cars can't, or conservative cars can go and liberal cars can't, or cars that are conducting business can go and cars that are not conducting business can't go. We look at our roads to be neutral, that all cars are the same. Unfortunately, the analogy breaks down when we start thinking about the internet, because we start thinking about asynchronous and synchronous. So let me talk a little about asynchronous and synchronous. Asynchronous means separated by time. So traditional and the original original internet applications like email and web downloads and file transfer protocols called FTP, they're asynchronous. When I send out an email and I'm sending those packets, I have no expectation that there will be any response immediately. And the key there, and this is why packet networks are so good, is that it's not bandwidth intensive. I can send a packet as bandwidth's available. Now, there exists a thing called synchronous, and that's linked in time. And I've got a diagram here of the difference between synchronous and asynchronous. Notice that asynchronous, every packet has a start and a stop, like a car, right? Synchronous is more like a train. And what we see for synchronous, there are things like voice, video, streaming media, and this is bandwidth intensive. And this is what's changed in the internet. When the internet was born, when net neutrality was the rule of the internet, when it made sense, everything was asynchronous. Today, we have this synchronous traffic going on, and that's what's creating the problem. If we go back to the road analogy, I have a picture here of a funeral procession. Now, a funeral procession would be a synchronous group of cars, and they get priority. When you go on the road and there's a funeral procession, they get priority. This is the same thing that's happening on the internet, is that we want to give priority to this synchronous traffic, because when we talk about voice and we talk about streaming media, we want that synchronous. We don't want gaps. Email, we're willing to accept gaps. You download an email, you'll be downloading the email and you'll notice it'll stop. Well, okay, it stops for a second till it catches up. Or let's say you send an email and it doesn't get there for another hour. Okay, well, we're used to that. But synchronous, we're not. Now, this is important here in terms of net neutrality. There exists a thing on the internet called quality of service. We call it QoS. And I'm going to read this because it's technical and I want to make sure we get it right. The recent rapid growth in the number of bandwidth-intensive and time-sensitive applications such as IP telephony, video conferencing, and other multimedia applications puts a strain on networks and keeps network administrators busy balancing capacity and performance. This happens today. There is a thing called QoS, and in fact, the new iteration of the internet, IPv6, actually enhances quality of service. So what is quality of service? Quality of service is a group of components that can differentiate traffic flows so that higher priority traffic receives preferential treatment. So going back to the funeral procession in the automobiles, is that normally one car does not get priority or another car. It's first come, first serve. But there are situations where the police might stop traffic to allow a funeral procession to go by. This is the way the network works. Network administrators can use QoS to effectively manage their resources and ensure that high-priority applications receive preferential treatment without adversely affecting the performance of more typical network traffic. So this is the key in terms of where net neutrality is going. So now let me talk about three key terms of network neutrality. The first one is called blocking, and that is if a consumer requests access to a website or service, the content is legal, your ISP or network provider should not be permitted to block it. Okay, that makes sense. Throttling is the ISP should not intentionally slow down some content or speed up others based on your ISP preferences. Now, by the way, I use ISP, which is Internet Service Provider, and Network Provider the same in this context. But when I go through the class, you'll see that there is a difference between the two, and I make a distinction between the two. But for our purposes here, the Internet Service Provider and Network Provider are the same thing. And then this is important, transparency. And that is network providers need to publish how they are routing packets so the marketplace can evaluate if the routing is appropriate. Okay, so those are three key terms in net neutrality. And in this course, I'm going to go into detail into what all these are and why they're important. This is just a high-level overview. The real controversial term in net neutrality is a thing called paid prioritization. And that's where network providers want to charge content providers more money to put their synchronous packets into fast lanes. And it makes sense that they would wish to do that because those synchronous packets use up a lot of bandwidth, and therefore it's realistic to think that those people should pay more. All right, so what is net neutrality then? The way I see it, net neutrality is a battle between those that want to stop network providers from creating these fast lanes and those that want to let the network providers continue to provide these fast lanes. There, in essence, is what net neutrality is about. And in this class, we're going to go into great detail in this in terms of what are the arguments in favor of both of these. Both of these positions have merit, and which is why they exist. And so we need to understand that. In my mind, net neutrality is a balance between the needs of the consumer to be able to access the content they want without the network provider interfering in that access, and the needs of the network provider to optimize the bits flowing through the network and make money at the same time. So to me, that's where the balance is. Now I'm going to tell you what my position is on this, just so you know as you go through the class you understand. I am a huge supporter of transparency. If we did nothing else and all we did was transparency, I would actually be happy with that. Because the more I know about the network provider is doing, the better I am at making my decisions. And by the way, this is something I believe in just globally, is that I want transparency to the source. The more I know about what people are doing, the better IRA is at making decisions. All right, so transparency would be my first choice. If nothing else, then we have transparency. I'd be happy. Going to the other things we talked about, I am in favor of no blocking of legal content, but I don't think that's a real problem. I don't think that most network providers and ISPs are really going to block legal content. That's not in their best interest, and we don't see that as being a huge issue. But I think that in terms of a policy, we need to be able to say that there should be no blocking. I am also in favor of no throttling if I don't know about the throttling. If the network provider does throttle, as long as they tell me that they're throttling, then I can make my decision of whether I want to use that network provider or ISP. In other words, if I know that a particular vendor is using a particular source and I don't like that source, I can choose to go to that vendor or not. Now, one of the challenges, of course, in net neutrality is the lack of competition, which we'll talk about in the class as to why this is complicated. It's not like, if Ford, for example, buys their parts from Vietnam and I don't want to my cars to have any parts made in Vietnam because I fought in the Vietnam War against the Vietnamese, then I can choose not to buy Ford. I can buy Chevy or something else. But if I only have one choice, if I only have one carrier, then I'm much more limited, and that complicates the problem. My big thing is I do not want the government to stop paid prioritization. That is my opinion. First of all, I don't think they technically can. I think that paid prioritization is a part of the telecommunications network, has been a part of the telecommunications network from the very beginning. And again, I'll go over why that is in more detail. And because I believe that there might be some real benefits to me if my network provider has paid prioritization. In other words, if they cut a deal with Comcast, with Netflix that gives me Netflix very fast, then that might be worth it to me. So I'm not against paid prioritization. In fact, I think it should be allowed. I just want transparency from the network provider that they have paid prioritization. What I don't want is paid prioritization for one carrier over another and me not know it. So if I look at Udemy, for example, I don't want my cable provider or my internet provider is Comcast. I don't want Comcast to be blocking or throttling Udemy because they have a different educational online service without them telling me that that's what they're doing.